Okay, so we're back for the discussion part of the symposium. Thanks to everybody for performing wonderful work. And I think it's work that maybe the public in general doesn't get to see. I think that's part of one of the efforts here is to get work out there that's been sort of treated in an underrepresented or marginalized way. And I think what I want to sort of do is, with this discussion portion of it, is, as I mentioned at the opening, is sort of talk about ways in which there are shared connections between all your work. And one of the most obvious things that I think is a sort of a good starting place and to sort of open the conversation is that, Darling, you and Jenn have both worked in burlesque. And I think that's an interesting shared background that I didn't know going into seeing your work, but it seems like there are sort of vastly different experiences you've had working in the burlesque world that I find intriguing, that I'd like to hear your thoughts and speak to a little bit. Like, working in nightclubs, you've had experience with groping and something. Yeah, and it seems like you've had a different experience.
I don't get, when I'm not performing, I've never gotten groped while on the evening of a performance. I've had people try to join me on stage because they're drunk. So they're like, I want to rock. And so there's been that, but I've never been groped. Groping usually happens if I'm just out hanging out. And then I'll be walking through the dance floor. And there's certain clubs that are much worse than others, but I'll be walking through the dance floor and then there'll be hands that are not my hands. And it's not that I don't necessarily have, personally, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. It's just more of because there's just a sea of people. And so it's just where did that just come from? Because there's so many bodies around me. And it's just that's the thing that's going to happen usually in a club setting, because people are often going out to find the person to hook up with. So, it's that kind of comes with being in that territory. So it's just I understand this is a thing. Boundaries are, for me, boundaries aren't necessarily a thing, but it's just boundaries definitely will get lost in a club setting because of inebriation and the intentions for why people are going out to the club. And it's a plethora of reasons why people are going out, but generally is to lose some type of inhibition,
So you think that's sort of a popular understanding of dance and how people engage it?
In club settings?
Well, club settings or outside of it is sort of, that it's about freeing oneself, or...
Yes, it's freeing oneself, but as far as the interaction of how people approach you, that varies on what space you're in. If you're in a proscenium style space, that's not gonna happen. If you're in a DIY space, that might happen, but that's not necessarily going to happen. It's more of but yeah, you never know. You never really know, because it's there could be that person in the crowd. There's always a person in the crowd someplace, So it's you're where you're supposed to be and doing what you're supposed to be doing, but you never know who's going to be I'm feeling some type of way, and they try to jump on the stage with you. Start heckling or whatever.
Have you had that experience too, Jenn, where people jumping on the stage with you?
Yeah, jumping on the stage or just wanting to be noticed. They want to be acknowledged.
Right. Just sort of entitlement.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times in burlesque, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but in burlesque, the shows that are, a lot of the downtown shows specifically are geared towards bachelorettes, and so people trying to have a good time, cut loose, what Darlene was saying. And I experienced that I have to work 5 times harder to keep them engaged, so that they don't want to take they don't want to. I don't want to say take the spotlight off of me, but they don't want to make it their show, essentially. Yeah.
I think with all of your work, there's a sort of performativity about the body and identity, and that, to a certain degree, the consensual side to that of how people take it, or how they will interact with you in a burlesque setting, but then I think that translates into how people are perceiving the work in other settings. And I think, when I think about your work, Carole, I think about it as a sort of interrogation of ableism, of ageism, of these sorts of elements as well. And I wonder if you feel like there's a sort of invisibility that you're pushing back against in these instances. And Carole, you specifically, I'm sort of wondering how that thread connects with your work.
Well, I guess I'm not consciously pushing against, no. Or the initial impulse is not necessarily to push against invisibility, but then
right.
Pretty soon, once you start working and anticipating an audience, and then actually sharing the work, then yes, then you are revealing yourself. I mean, it's sort of like what we were talking about, Jenn and I were talking about in terms of performing topless,
right.
and just the potential that somebody might be challenged by what you show, that it might not be what they expected or what they wanted or what.
But that's a different phase in the process is what I'm getting from you, is that there's a phase at which you begin to think about that audience engagement piece.
But yeah, not necessarily at the very beginning. It's really the thing itself, the desire to put one's sensation, or for me, to put my experience and my sensation into the framework of art, and to endure it in that way and transform it in that way.
Right.
And
through Buto and Tango in your case. So Ellen, when you're working with Comfort Station or working through your visual art practice, is this something you're thinking about too in terms of audience? Is that?
Yes, for sure. Especially when you're trying to put together something where people are going to be in a space, you do have to think about the type of audience or what has been seen, what has not been seen. And specifically at Comfort Station, that's what we've been trying to push things that are not necessarily viewed, maybe taken from the DIY spaces, but taken from different spaces all around. And there is sometimes a pushback because there is a certain expectation one might have. And when you talk about race too, race, sexuality, people have this, even the ones that try to be very open, still have a certain expectation. So on the bad side of that, it's people have this expectation, they might not be as open, but on the good side is that when you show them something, that it kind of opens their mind and kind of pushes them further. So
you have to educate your audience as you go.
You do. You have to be very careful. Be careful while at the same time being very avant-garde, knowing when to kind of push. And being conscious on both sides.
What do you think from anybody here, what do you think the biggest challenges are in terms of educating your audience? It seems like it's sort of a constant battle to get and this is part of the purpose of this panel is, I think there's a gap out there in terms of people understanding the work. We sort of talked about this initially. What is the challenges, the biggest challenges or hurdles for you guys in terms of people understanding what you're doing?
I don't care.
Right, okay.
I kind of agree, because I don't understand my work either, so how can I possibly expect somebody else to?
But if they see it more and more, they become familiar with it, right? Would you think that's...
Yeah, and familiarity is not always the same thing as
right.
understanding,
okay.
but
Absolutely. Great, that's a good point. In terms of the sort of... this is something I want to go back to with you from your initial column. You're talking about political organizing and the workshop for making protest banners and different things. Is that sort of evolving in your work now as well?
Oh, absolutely. Because I come from for me, I come from a space where I was not formally trained. I dare I say that I was just naturally talented in like art and drawing. I don't want to say like, let me ask this question too. Is it okay that we swear?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
we're all good.
Finish that line.
I was saying it's gonna slip out. But no, like I come from a place where like, art was just there, it was just in me.
Yeah.
And when I do like my personal stuff, like I pull from those memories, so just like you're talking about the pork chops. Yeah,
Right.
see, it's like, those things.
There's a racial exigency to some of our language use, some of our how we engage it.
Absolutely, and so definitely, especially in the climate now, you have like, you can't just sit and say nothing. You have it's in your face every day.
Well, this is a great point because to go back to your column, darling. I think initially you said something along the lines of I'm Switzerland on political affairs. Like you really do sort of take an arm's length approach to it when it comes to the political aspect of the work.
I wasn't raised in it. I was raised by my grandparents who were Jehovah's Witness, so that religion is a neutral religion, and so they don't even vote. So I wasn't raised in a political household, and so trying to jump into it, like going through school, that was like political science was the hardest class for me because there was so much stuff, and I was just like, I don't really care about this. Like I was never taught to care about this, and it's interesting being. I think I'm still a community leader. I don't know, but
Yeah, you sort of take on that position as an artist, right?
But I am. I'm still a community leader, and that's something that will like come up and where certain panels I'll be asked to sit on and talk about certain things, and then it's just like. I've gotten to the point where I forewarn everybody. It's just like, I just want you to know, if you have me be a part of this thing, I'm not going to have the conversation the way that you're expecting me to have the conversation. And I'm going to talk about it very hippy-dippy. So we're going to be talking about vibrations and frequency and vibrational matches. So if you don't want to hear that, then I suggest you not to invite me, because that's where I stand in regard to everything.
Yeah, right.
So,
Well, I mean, I think in the comp we talked about the sort of nurture side of that equation, which is different for everybody. And you mentioned getting a lot of support in high school, a lot of support from strong women who were helping you with your work and your interests. Right. But I think there were differences. Like I think you talked about Grandpa Robbins being a difference. And I think you talked about the being at the Comedy Store and sort of recognizing there was this invisibility that was happening with you and your partner at the time. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
So essentially, actually, the act that I performed was the act that was inspired by this incident of being. I was in New York, and we went to a comedy club. It was me and my partner, my wife at the time. We were an interracial couple, and we were sitting there, and I don't really know much about comedy, but it seems like in New York, the thing to do with comics is to go around the room and kind of like pick on everyone. And all these comics would come out, and they would just, do the thing. They scan the room and pick on the room. And every comedian that came out did not acknowledge me and my partner. And I think it was because they probably couldn't really read the situation. They didn't know if we were together or not. I mean, I don't know. I think at the time she's pretty butch looking. Like I feel like you look at her and you're like, that's a lesbian. But I think when people look at me, they don't really know how to read it. People don't know. And that kind of pissed me off. I don't like, I don't. It's just it got to the point where for me it was like awkward. So that's where the act that for the record is what I call it. Comes from. It's kind of wanting to take up space and put the femme top, quote unquote, like on stage.
Right.
Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of influence and socialization and where people are sort of find their source material is really intriguing to me. Because what's happening is this feedback loop that this whole idea of social movements and social influence on artists' work. Artists are really in a dialogue, in a sense. You know, it may be to a degree more politicized or less politicized, but so you know, talking about your experience and these points of contact with the public or with family and the public and private dynamic of that is very intriguing to me. Now you talked about Robin's sort of, I don't want to say disparagingly, but there was a sense wherein you were like, my limits were very pronounced, where I was sort of funneled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll try to quickly explain that. Like, so Robbins is like this very small town, south side of Chicago, but not quite Chicago, and it's actually surrounded by like all these white suburbs. So it's like technically in the suburbs, but it's a very historic like black town. Started off, I think, one of the first, and I think still one of the only all black like run towns in the country, and also one of the poorest. So it wasn't quite as bad as some parts of the city. It was bad, and still has some struggles, some economical struggles and crime. But the interesting part was just like the boundary was so bold, like just walking under a viaduct in Chicago is very like, has had the reputation, I think still is very like segregated in a lot of ways. And like I don't know if we talked about it, like I went to a school district like in the 80s that basically had Robin's kids on one half of the district, and the other half was like white, and they sprinkled some people of color in. So yeah, it just was. It was a very hard place. Like I think when you come from some place, it's like a love and hate relationship. But it was a lot of limiting things, and I'm not just going to put that on just the neighboring white communities. A lot of it was from them, but it was just really hard because I had no artists. I had really not a lot of people in the vicinity to kind of look at for my art. So that's kind of where like I was a drawer, but the music, and I was raised by like 95% women. So I didn't have my biological father around. I was raised with my mother, grandfather. So I had like 5 mothers, my godmother, aunts, uncles, but mostly aunts. And so yeah, like music was that thing that we kind of shared, and like that was that thing that, you know, it kind of helped me to get away from stuff, check out, and then eventually now it's helping me to get further away, or to kind of, well, not further away, but to conversate about those things, to kind of dig into like what I experienced growing up, and then, you know, talk about them. And it's very cathartic, and I hope that it's cathartic for other people too.
Right, music figures prominently. I remember you talking about your, I don't know if it was your mother or your grandmother's stereo.
Yeah, my mother's stereo. Yeah. Looking at the topography, taking like these like records, and you know, like the Earth, Wind and Fire like records. Yeah. And so like, you know, some of them had some stuff on there that, you know, maybe a 4-year-old shouldn't have been looking at. But I mean, like I would just be looking through, and then like that helped to really trigger like at the time I didn't know what the hell a graphic designer was. Right. Yeah. But that's what I went to school for in undergrad, as being a graphic designer. I hated it, but then I moved on to painting and getting music. So I've gone around. But yeah, so like just looking at the stereo and looking at the topography and like all these, I don't want to say weird, it's not weird, it's just like these vibes, these things that you kind of get, these feelings, these emotions. And when you kind of if I look at another like stereo or I hear a certain song, I go back to that song.
No, I think it's an interesting pivot to talk about all this sort of like outside influences on artist work. And Carole, you're really like responding to this disease you've been wrestling with over the last few years too. Can you tell us
A couple of months actually.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because my work has been kind of about mortality and the fragility of the body for a while, because I am a 2-time cancer survivor starting in 2008. But it's funny, I had been in recent years, you know, sort of free and clear and getting kind of smug, you know, and moving on, at least in my mind, to other themes. And but then this year, I'm a big addict for Argentine tango, and I've been dancing tango for about 20 years. And so I go down to Buenos Aires usually pretty much every winter to get a major fix of tango, because that's the home place of tango. So I landed in Buenos Aires on January 10th this year, and I got off the plane, and I didn't get my land legs back.
Huh.
And I thought, oh, I'm just really tired. I didn't sleep on the flight. I'll rest. And I rested, and the next morning, I still didn't have my land legs, and the next week I didn't, and up until now, I still haven't gotten my land legs back. And finally, I got a diagnosis for what it is, and it's this rare neurological thing called maldebarkment, which means bad disembarkation. And so it's affecting my whole sense of balance, because basically right now this bench is rocking up and down as if I were on a boat, and basically 24/7 I'm experiencing this weird rocking. What a fucking annoying mode to have research, direct personal research for Buto movement. I mean, it's disorienting, it's totally transformed. There's a complete disjuncture between what my body is telling me and what I know is to be true. And so it's like I'm living in two worlds at the same time, all the time. I'm looking forward to being in one world again. I'm hoping that treatment is going to help me. There's not a lot out there because this is so rare and weird. But what am I going to do? All I can do is dance it. It's certainly, I'm lucky that my form is Buto, which welcomes the ungraceful and acknowledges it and accepts it as beautiful. And so, I'm just going to have to work with it and then hope that it fades away the way my cancer experiences have moved into the past. And then thematically, it'll just be past experience that will inform me rather than actual lived experience. But I've been thinking, of course, quite a bit about the whole question of how, I don't know if it's only dance, maybe it's all art making. I mean, we have this sort of problem of that it takes courage to live by oneself in one's own body, and that's one thing. And then it also takes courage to bring your body out into the world among other bodies and potentially be vulnerable to their opinion, their groping, their whatever, and your own fears of their judgment or what they might do, your vulnerabilities. And so there's this sort of weird imbalance with that too, here is my home, but maybe it's not. Maybe this is not my home. And I think that's a thing for dancers in general.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, you dance because you love your body. You dance because you hate your body and you want to escape it. And so there's no clear truth on it. It's sort of, you're always kind of wobbling around between those two, wobbling, choice of words.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating for me because I think, when in your column you describe dance as the audience in the world sort of looking at it as the sweet little old lady of arts. Like that there's this sort of notion that dance is on a lower register than some of the other high arts, right?
It's supposed to be nice. It's supposed to be like, wow, it's physical fitness, and you're isn't that pretty, but that's so it's kind of dismissive.
Well, but again, I think that's everybody here at this table is makes work that's the opposite of that characterization. Fierce in many, many degrees, and is that something you're conscious of, for instance, in your work that stands out of that?
Yeah, but I think that it's interesting because now I'm getting, the spaces are changing for me, so I'm not necessarily in nightclub settings. I am in higher end black box spaces, and I'm noticing that it is harder for me. Like I said, I need the audience to participate in order. The more that you give me, the more that I'm going to give, and I'm going to always try to top it. So it's a conversation. And in these spaces where people are used to sitting down and observing entertainment, or whatever, getting an experience and leaving, it is. And this is probably selfish, but you know, part of performance is it feeds something in me that I need. And so in these spaces where the audience isn't engaging or giving or just being active, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It's funny that you say that, because in this, right now with the residency, like figuring out things, I think it was yesterday, I was on the train going over like the playlist and like trying to put things in order, and I was like, I think I'm going to have signs kind of like at live television shows, and I'm going to have people like hold up signs at specific times for like when you talk, or like it's okay to like make comments or something. Like I'm thinking I'm gonna have that be a part of the performance in some way or form, because there are moments where it's just like you want them to get excited, but they're not. They depend on the crowd. Some crowds are like gonna go there with you when you're sitting in the proscenium style land, and then some crowds are going to just sit there and observe and just like applaud at the time that they think they're supposed to applaud, which is like usually at the end of the thing. And so it's just like, what are those triggering points to get them? Because we all share that. We've all performed together at different times, and we all share that very like interactive performance. And so when you are in that place of like 360, like being able to like reach out and touch somebody, and then you're that's taken away from you. It's just like, how do I still reach out and touch someone when there is like 20 feet, sometimes 30 feet depending on which stage you're on, between us? How do you still get that point across? And so that's been an interesting thing that I'm like navigating because even though I do the combination of like clubs and gallery performances and theater performances, it's very rare that I'm in the space of proscenium, and now a lot of my performances starting to shift into the lane of proscenium, and I'm just like, oh, dang, okay, all right, if that's what the evolution of it is, that's fine. But that's something that I'm definitely like trying to hold on to, where it's just like reaching larger audiences, but still being able to reach out and touch someone.
Well, speaking of residencies too, and I think just you mentioned the move to more black box spaces and this kind of thing. Like, it seems to me like maybe even a year ago, I was sitting in Links Hall remarking on how many of the performers were white, honestly, or this stereotype of like young dancer, ballet dancer. It seems like that's shifted. I'd love to hear your opinions on it. Has it shifted, and is it something that's going to continue to be more progressive, or is that something that's a matter of like what's in the air, and then things maybe shift back? I mean, obviously the environment now is there's a nationalist resurgence, and it's very sort of racially and class divisive. And I think it frightens me to think that maybe some of the gains we've gotten aren't permanent. And I see this in the arts as a place where we're having a discourse about who we are as people, and that it's opened up has been very promising. Do you think that is something that will continue, or like, what is your sense of how things have sort of evolved to the point right now?
I guess I think, for me, I'm thinking of what comes to mind is only now am I starting to reach out and apply for grants and apply for money outside of, you know, the burlesque format. So I don't know, because I'm aware, when I apply for grants now, I am very aware that like, I'm providing mini boxes for people to check off. You know, I'm Black, I'm queer, and I'm also presenting burlesque, which is like, it's kind of like part of pop culture. So it's flashy, it's hot. So I don't know. I don't know. And I think that, like you said, now, what is kind of cool is maybe it's my own network, but it seems like people are interested in providing visibility and opportunities for brown and POC folk.
Yeah.
Especially with there's so much call out too of like you said, people are taking note of all of these galleries are showing white work, or there's all these conversations. I hope it's not temporary, not just because it's giving me more work, but because it needs to happen. Like,
Yeah, well, dance needs to change.
Yeah,
Dance needs to change. I think that's been an issue here. Dance and performance need to change. They were being very exclusive, and there was a sense of entitlement that was feeding all that. And I still hear it, but then we have like Alan, like programming performance for Comfort Station. I think it's great that these voices are sort of being heard in a way that they hadn't previously.
Well, and I guess I think too, like, I think one, what little Jenn would think if they walked into a space and saw Darling perform, like, I can't even imagine how my life would have changed knowing that there, like, that is like my reflection looking back on me. It took me years to be able to see that in a performance setting. And I think too, like, what is it gonna take for people like Darling or myself or Carolyn to be at like the Harris Theater, like in these like big spaces that's again still has like a certain procedural elite perspective to it that's only showing ballet or.
Yeah, do you think the big institutions are still sort of inaccessible?
I don't think
It's
they're
not that
looking
they're
at us.
inaccessible, it's just that the place like I think it was last year, 2 years ago, the Harris Theater started this like choreography mentorship thing or choreography residency thing. And so it was like this whole like big whoop to do, and it's just like choreographers will be able to come in and set work, and then they'll be able to use the Harris Theater, and it's like I think like 6-month residencies or something like that. The first choreographer that they picked wasn't from Chicago. That was and so that like made everybody upset. And then it was like this very big, well-known choreographer, and so the dance community was like, so what is the purpose of this thing? Because it's like, is this actually for the like development and betterment of the Chicago dance scene, and then is it for specific people in the Chicago dance scene? I haven't really heard anything else about the thing. I probably fell through because a lot of people were so upset by it. There were so many articles that like came out about that, but it's one of those things where it's just like there have been a few institutions that I've worked with that has been like, yes, awesome, and then there have been some other institutions that I've tried to work with, and it's like, this has the potential to be awesome, but it has fallen through, and then after like a certain amount of time, it's just like, well, the excuse they give is because of the patrons that are the patrons and donors. They're trying so hard to cater to them, and so they end up overlooking or redoing things that would be a little bit more expansive as far as the performance goes, and just going back to what the people who are giving them the money are used to. But when you're in that space, I was talking with a good friend of mine who's a DJ. This was a few years ago, and he was he DJs around the city, and like he's a celebrity DJ essentially. And so he was DJing at Untitled. He used to do he used to be the resident DJ for Unbridled, which is the burlesque show that they do at Untitled. So one evening we were talking about it, and he was just like, I I'm so tired of people coming up to me asking for requests, and that's not my job, firstly. And then secondly, I'm not here to give you something that you already know. I'm here to help you experience something that you don't know. I'm here to give you something new. Why, what's the purpose of going out and getting the same thing over and over again? That gets boring. That gets boring for me. I don't want to do that. I wouldn't want to do that, and so many people do that.
Right.
And so when you have places who are being conditional in the sense of, well, since this is what Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz liked, and since Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz just gave us $1 million, we need to make sure that we have this thing that Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz likes. And it's just like, you're not helping Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz by giving them what they want. That doesn't do any good for anybody. So it's like getting away from that. And then it's just really interesting too, just how that whole world works, because I was at the New Contemporary wing of the Art Institute, and you like see the names of like donors, and there were like 5 names that were anonymous. It said anonymous. Mr. and Mrs. Shively, Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz, Miss Karenina, and then you have anonymous, and then it's like name, and then anonymous, and then name, and it's just like, well, if you want it to be anonymous, why even go through the trouble of having them put anonymous up there? Just give the money and don't worry about it. So you don't really want to be that anonymous because
you got a placeholder in the list.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's that whole thing where it's just like the politics of it all. I don't get involved. Fuck politics. I don't get involved with politics. I don't care about politics.
Yeah.
I really don't care. I did a performance and they were like, no nudity, and I was just like, it's happening.
Right.
You're born into this world naked. You leave this world naked. I'm not dancing suggestively. The piece is about unveiling and getting back to your natural state of being. If someone has a problem with in their natural state of being, then you need to go and sit down and have a talk with God, because that's the only thing that I'm ever bringing to the table is how to get back to you.
Right.
And did the performance. It was actually for the Starving Artists Gallery. Did the performance. To this day, I still have people, and that was 3 years ago, I still have people coming up to me being like, oh my goodness, I saw you perform at the Starving Artists Gallery. You did this piece where you took off all your clothes and it was so powerful. Made my artistic director cry, made a few other people cry, and it was just like, and there's power in the thing that is nudity, because people believe that when you're nude, you're vulnerable. And it's just, for me, I don't believe that. I believe when you're naked, that's when you're most powerful, because it's saying, I don't need all of this extra adornment to present a specific thing to you so that you can feel better about yourself. I'm going to be here in my naturalness, in my me-ness, and you have 1 or 2 things. Get up to speed with how your inner being is actually looking at the situation, or look at it from the way that your eyes are looking at it, which is separation from how your inner being is looking at it. And that's the reason that you're feeling the way you're feeling, because you're looking in a separate place than where your inner being is looking.
When this is how they sort of attack things they don't like, not to sort of make us present, but I think, people who are the racist dog whistle or the sort of ageist dog whistle or whatever is obscenity, right? That's obscene. Put some clothes on, and it's because they want to. There's an erasure, a process of erasure there, right? We don't want to see. We don't want to idealize these things.
A lot of people hold on to religion, even though they might not necessarily. They hold on to it because that's something that's just been instilled for so long. We've been domesticated into religion for so many years, and so you have people who are holding on to certain religious beliefs because that's what their parents did, and their parents didn't go to church, but their grandparents went to church, and so it's just something that was passed down. So now you have all these people who are being like, no, that's bad, and it's just like, no, you're wrong. There's nothing inappropriate about being naked. It's clothing, actually, which is the thing that's the suggestive thing for sex. If you look at fashion history, they made the hips bigger to be suggestive. That's why they had bustles, to make it suggestive for being a fertile woman because you have childbearing hips. They put corsets on and then made them low to present the bust. They made heels are to project things out. Heels originally were for men, and that was like a high class thing. And then it went to started to be worn by women. And then the purpose of the heel was to present those because it tilts you forward. So clothing is the thing that's actually sexually suggestive, not the naked body.
I think we're gonna need to wrap up so we can have a little bit of time to hear Alan's business and tunes. And I've got a number of thank yous to get through here. But this is to just put a cap on that. I think that's the reason Socrates said the living unexamined life isn't worth living. Right? We need to think about who we are and think about what that means in terms of how we influence the world. And shutting down depictions of who we are is a problem. And thank you everyone for coming out and sharing your work with us and sharing your ideas. And they're endlessly an inspiration to me, and I could have this conversation for 4 hours. But to you all, Carole McCurdy, Darling Squad, Jenn Freeman, and Alan Moore, I need to thank Joanna and Dovetail for hosting this for us tonight, and to 60 Inches from Center for carrying the columns, the Illinois Humanities Council for buying us the wine and helping us get a videographer, and helping get the word out. Newcity, Chicago Dancemakers Forum, and High Concept Labs. Our next panel is at the Old Town School of Folk Music on April 22nd. It is called Body Politic, and it is an examination of the connection between movement art and social movements. We are sitting that panel with William Ayers, professor at UIC, and from the Weather Underground, and from Columbia College, Paige Cunningham and Onya Zuzu, my partner and operations manager at Place Lab, Nami Miller, Yolanda Kerslach from the MCA, Karen Hansen from the Selvos, and Anna Martine Whitehead, dancer and performance person. So big panel, and hope you all make it out. We will also be putting this up on the Movement Matters page, so like us and stay tuned. Thank you so much.